Do you remember back doing algebra, we talked about like the square root of 9, and at first your brain says, oh, I know, that's -3. But -3 times -3 is actually +9, not -9. And so there is no number that times itself will actually give you -9. However, there is a trick, right? Do you remember this? We can divide this into the square root of 9 and the square root of -1. The square root of 9 is 3, and then the square root of -1, a guy named Euler came up with the symbol I to represent the imaginary number square root of -1, because there actually is there's no real number for the square root of -1. But if we let I represent that, then we can actually do some things with I. And then that opens up a whole new set of numbers called the set of complex numbers, where we have a real number and an imaginary number, link them together, and you have a complex number, okay? So the square root of -1 is I. So what would I squared be? I times I is square root of -1 times the square root of -1, which would be -1, okay? If you have 3 i's, I, that gives you, this would come out, become -1, because the -1 pops out. Square root of -1 is I, so the answer would be -I. Okay, are you following this? And then if I to the 4th power would be I squared, which is -1, times square root of times I, which is -1. Okay, -1 times -1 is +1. So I to the 4th, I would be 1. Okay, now what happens if I have like I to the 7th? I. I to the 4th times I to the 3rd, well, 4 plus 3 is 7. I to the 4th, we can see that's just -1, I mean just +1. So 1 times, what is I to the 3rd? -I. So 1 times -I is just -I. So this whole thing would become -I. So the PACE points out that I raised to any power actually simplifies to either being I, -1, -I, or +1. Those are the only options, okay? So that will simplify a good bit of 1 or 2 pages for you. Now let's talk about when we're adding. If we're adding 2 complex numbers, we take the real parts out front and we add them together. So 8 plus -2 is 6, and then I can add 5i plus 4i is 9, and I just leave it as I. It's kind of like dealing with x's or a's or any variable. You just add the coefficients, keep the I. Okay, so that's pretty easy. If we're subtracting, it's like we're adding the opposite of those two. So you distribute the negative sign, and now you can add 2 plus -1 is 1. 1i plus -6i would be -5i. Or we could say 1 minus 5i, same thing. Let's talk about if we're multiplying. Do you remember how to do the FOIL method? First, outer, inner, last. So we can do 4 times 2 is 8. The outer is 4 times +1i, so plus 4i. In the middle here, -5i times 2 would be -10i. And then when I do -5i times +i, I would get -5i squared. But what is I squared? Let's look at it again. That's -1. So this is really 5 times -1. 5 times -1 is +5. Okay? So now you can add the 8 plus 5, get 13. 4i plus -10i. 4 plus -10 is -6. We just tack on the I. Okay? So remembering the FOIL method from Algebra 1 shouldn't be too hard. It's just that we are going to have the i's in here, and so we have to be careful to remember these. It's good to memorize these 4 steps. Sometimes I think it's helpful if you write this down on a 3x5 card or a Post-it note, or put it in your notebook and take a mental picture of that, and then that will help you as you move forward through this section.